Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be going over some critiques from Synthetic Man's review of God of War Ragnarok. His reviews on games generally suck due to him being a contrarian, but we'll get to that later. I'm going to be playing some audio clips from his review and going after each of his silly critiques. There's a lot of them. Also touching upon his lack of general video game knowledge. I'm going to split this into hopefully just two parts because I want to tackle as much of his critiques, if you can even call them that, and let's go.
As for the main combat mechanics themselves, I'd say they're pretty fun. I thought they were fun in the last game too. It does take a while to get going. For some reason, they pulled a Metroid with this game, and Kratos just mysteriously has lost almost all of his abilities and gear from the last game. And so the game kind of feels afraid to give you all of the combat mechanics until about 10 hours in, which makes those early combat encounters a bit more boring. It doesn't help that I was playing it on hard mode, which I'll save that for the end.
So I'm not sure if Synthetic Man is familiar with the God of War franchise, but if he was, then he'd know that Kratos losing his abilities and weapons in the sequel games is a staple of the franchise. In fact, this is a common video game practice. It's almost ubiquitous across, say about most sequels in most franchises.
Parrying. Now, I will say the parry feels pretty weak until your starting shield gets repaired and then you actually get invincibility frames on the riposts. But before that point, I was very disappointed in the parry. Against mini bosses and bosses, you would actually have to parry them multiple times in the same combo just to stop the onslaught, which was honestly infuriating.
So after your fight with Thor in the beginning of the game, you're going to be given the option to craft 1 to 2 new shields called the Dauntless or Stonewall. And until you reach a certain point in the story, you won't get your original shield back. I'm assuming the reason they did this was to introduce the player to new ways of defensive options. The Dauntless shield stores energy into the shield after every parry, charging your shield bash attack. The downside to this shield is the lack of iframes in between parries, so pick your parries wisely. Stonewall absorbs damage for a unique shield slam attack. Before you get the OG shield back, you'll be introduced to 2 or 3 other types of shields with their own mechanics and defensive playstyles.
The bosses, on the other hand, are a mixed bag. Some of them are pretty great. Some of them, like the Hateful, are just fucking annoying to fight, have random unblockable moves that make no sense. The fucking God of War can't block a random fire skeleton's X-swing. My immersion is destroyed.
Now certainly he doesn't mean random as in any one of their attacks can be unblockable at random. I'm assuming he means, why does this enemy in particular have a attack that is unblockable? Well, why does any enemy, especially the mini bosses, have unblockable moves? It's a part of the game. You can tell he just got frustrated with the boss. What's funny is that the Hateful is just the more chunkier version of the basic enemies from the first game. This is definitely a skill issue.
And the first Berserker fight, which is mandatory by the way, has way too much fucking health. Oh yeah, and I was bumped down to normal at this point too.
Not only is the first Berserker fight not mandatory, but if you watch his fight with the Berserker, he's under-leveled, which is why the Berserker takes a lot more damage to take down.
When I finally managed to beat him, I think it took me 3 straight minutes of dodging and countering the same 4 attacks over and over again to actually...
So, like a Souls game boss, which you claim to be a fan of.
Whittle down his health bar. It doesn't help that filling the stun meter doesn't give you a free execution type of attack on him. It just opens him up to damage for a few seconds.
When you stun a boss, it takes a chunk of their health away. Also, it opens them up to even more damage.
The enemy variety, as this was something the developers actually praised about this game, and it feels completely unearned because guess what? They reused almost every enemy type from the first game. I mean, exact same animations and attacks Same executions too, and oh, I could talk about the executions and how almost all of them are lacking any sort of gore, which yes.
Almost every single sequel in the God of War franchise uses almost all of the same enemies from the previous game, in addition to the newer enemies. Another common video game practice as old as gaming in itself. He claims that the game lacks gore, and I really don't understand what he means by this. Most enemies can be dismembered, not only with stun and kills, but whenever an enemy is like one hit from death, you can dismember them to your liking. The only enemies whose deaths are lacking gore are the animal type enemies. Usually Kratos will snap their necks or jaws. The reason why I think there's this somewhat tamed gore with the animal type enemies is because of organizations like PETA not wanting to see excessive brutality on mythological animals, but guess what? They still complain about a particular animal later in the game. I'm not going to spoil it, but it's ridiculous of what PETA chooses to be outraged about.
To the enemy variety, I feel like a lot of the new enemy types are just kinda lame, like generic Viking raiders on Midgard, or the Asgard warriors, which are all zombies, the frog enemies that surprisingly show up in like 3 different realms, and a lot of the ones that aren't lame visually anyway, are actually very annoying to fight, like the new light elf variant that's a samurai, or the Asgard warrior who has a Bifrost pick and a hammer. These motherfuckers can attack at lightning speed and have unblockable moves, or moves you have to parry, and can dodge out of the middle of combos, shit like that just makes them not very fun to engage with unless you're spamming runic attacks.
Once again, this is a skill issue. Complaining about a game for having enemies who have unblockables and guard breaks is not a valid criticism.
Criticism of the combat, let's talk about hard mode somewhat briefly.
I skip ahead a little because he talks about a bug that switched him back to hard mode after he switched to normal. Fair criticism, but we're about to get into what's probably the worst critique about the combat.
What hard mode really does, it gives every enemy in the game super armor. Yes, even basic enemy types. So my original recording for this combat section was actually much more negative than this, because I was very annoyed by the fact that every single enemy would either dodge out of the middle of your combo or attack straight through the motherfucking God of War's X-Swings to the chest. I just figured it was a normal gameplay mechanic that only heavy attacks and runic attacks would actually stun the enemy, because I don't think I've ever encountered a hard mode that introduces super armor. What a horrible fucking idea. That's it.
This is one of the biggest indicators that Synthetic Man is either feigning ignorance or he is genuinely ignorant about video games. Now, someone who's claimed to have played most of the Soulsborne franchise, such as him, he should probably recognize the poise mechanic when they see it, or at least a pseudo poise mechanic, because the game doesn't tell you exactly what it is, but we can tell that it's poised based on how it functions. On the harder difficulties, enemies no longer get interrupted by light attacks, so you have to use the attacks that do more poise damage to stagger them, whether it be heavy attacks, heavy axe throws, head or leg axe throws, runic attacks, or the whirlwind combos, which are diet runic attacks. Either way, enemies don't get super armor. For those who want to know the difference, super armor is a mechanic more prevalent in fighting games that prevents attacks from being interrupted. Poise is a mechanic most famously used in the Soulsborne games that acts as passive stagger stun protection, whether being idle or while attacking. So I'm going to spare you guys the audio clips, but from here on out he starts making somewhat valid criticisms, and it's not that bad. He's basically talking about RPG elements, but nothing too crazy. Then he starts talking about the puzzles and how there's probably too much of them, and I can understand that. He also talks about the backseat gaming from the AI companions during the puzzles, and that's definitely a valid criticism. Later on he starts talking about how the level design is too linear and how there's just hallways and branching paths, but anybody knows that if you're familiar with the God of War franchise, then that's how they always been. But he makes it seem as though they're linear hallways, like they're just straight paths, and he compares it to some Final Fantasy game that had a whole bunch of, I guess, straight hallways. It's not a great comparison at all. So, in conclusion, Synthetic Man is an incredibly jaded casual gamer slash contrarian who thinks he's a hardcore gamer for some reason, or at least acts like one in my opinion. He despises modern gaming for good reason. Modern gaming is terrible, but you can't let it turn you into an overly critical contrarian. Trust me, everyone wants to be an edgy contrarian and stand out, calling everyone's game trash until they're met with the same treatment. It's all fun and games until some basement-dwelling neckbeard decides to analyze your favorite game. I was thinking about making a part 2 to this, touching upon his critiques about the story, because they're probably some of the worst takes on gaming ever. Yeah, other YouTubers already talked about his story critiques, and they're really bad. He then made response videos to the quote-unquote Sony fanboys, and it showcases one of the biggest cop-outs I've ever heard. He basically says the reason why his videos aren't, thoroughly researched is because he ultimately doesn't care about YouTube. And there's a huge contradiction to that, because you can actively see him arguing with people in his comment section, even his fans. People are just like, hey, I like some of your work, but this is, kind of bad. And he just gets mad at them too. And then he makes response videos to fanboys. So you can tell he values his opinion. Like he sees his opinion way bigger than anything else. Like everybody else's. It's in my opinion, just straight up narcissism. But hey, whatever. Alright guys, this is about it. I'm done. I'll see you guys later. Peace.